So much for joining us. Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us for a conversation about spiritual responses to racial justice, sponsored by the George Mason Campus Ministry Association. My name is Nicole Fetterman, and I'm a student leader with George Mason Catholic Patriots. Dr. Martin King Jr.'s commitment to racial justice was founded on his religious faith, and the same has been true of social reformers throughout history. Very often, those who work hardest to advance social justice are motivated by a spiritual outlook and commitment. Tonight, we'll have the opportunity to hear from representatives of the Baha'i faith, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, who will share how their faith tradition views racial justice and how members of their faith tradition put their beliefs into action. Before we hear from our panelists, we have the privilege of hearing Reverend Jeffrey Johnson, Senior Pastor at Mount Calvary Baptist Church in Fairfax, whose dramatization of Dr. King's 1963 I Have a Dream speech will take us back to a powerful moment in the fight for racial justice in the United States.
I am happy to join with you today in that which will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon of light and of hope to millions of Negro slaves being seared in a flame of a withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro in America still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacle of segregation and the chain discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty amid a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro lives in a shameful corner of disgrace and dishonor, and we have come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we have come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, they were signing a promissory note that all Americans were to fall heir. That yes, black men as well as white men would be guaranteed the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check that has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. We refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. So we have come here to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. And we also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off nor taking the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to lift our nation from the dark and desolate valleys of segregation to the sunlit paths of racial justice. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. The whirlwinds of revolt shall continue to shake the foundations of our nation till the bright day of freedom emerges. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro just needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. The whirlwinds of revolt shall continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of freedom emerges. But there is something that I must say to my people, which stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In our process of finding our rightful place, we must not be found guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and of hatred. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. And this marvelous new militancy which has so engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidence of their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is bound to our destiny. They have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must always make the pledge to march ahead. And I know there are those who are asking the double T's of civil rights. When will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is still the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro cannot stay in the motels of the highways or the hotels of the cities. We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and the Negro in New York feels he has nothing for which to vote. No, no, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I am not unmindful that some of you come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you come from areas where your quest for freedom have left you staggered by the winds of police brutality, but continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi, go back to Louisiana, go back to Georgia, go back to Alabama, go back to the slums and the ghettos of the northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. For I say unto you today, my friends, even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day that this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners, that they will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream today. I have a dream that even in Alabama, with its vicious racists, its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, that one day right there in Alabama, little white boys and white girls will be able to join hands with little black boys and black girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream that one day that even in the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of oppression, sweltering with the heat of injustice, one day will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and equality. I have a dream that one day that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. If America is to become a great nation, this must be true. So let freedom ring. From the bodacious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring not only from there, but from Stone Mountain of Georgia and from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring. And when this happens, when we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village, from every hamlet, from every state, and from every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will all join hands and sing in the Negro spiritual bowl, free at last, thank God Almighty, I'm free at last.
All right, now we'll hear from our panelists who will share with us how their faith traditions view racial justice and how members of their faith traditions put their beliefs into action. Our first panelist is Nuri Songer-Johnson, a member of the Baha'i community of Reston who identifies as biracial.
Hi, I'm Nuri Songer-Johnson. Thank you for inviting me to talk about an issue that is of paramount importance. I think it's wonderful that you guys are bringing together people from all different backgrounds to talk about a spiritual response to racial justice. And I also wanted to let everyone know that throughout my presentation, I will be using a lot of words that are not only mine, but also words from the governing bodies of the Baha'i faith. The Baha'i faith centers around the oneness of humanity and condemns all manners of prejudice and superstition, and claims the purpose of religion is to be the promotion of amity and concord. So tonight we're definitely in the right place because we're trying to merge spirituality and racial unity. The elimination of racism has long been viewed as the most challenging issue confronting America. Shoghi Effendi, who is the guardian of the Baha'i faith, said, "As to racial prejudice, the corrosion of which for well nigh a century has bitten into the fiber and attacked the whole social structure of American society. It should be regarded as constituting the most vital and challenging issue." The National Spiritual Assembly says that Americans' peace, prosperity, and even her standing in the international community depend to a great extent on the resolution of this issue. The National Spiritual Assembly, they go further to say that the tribulations now encompassing much of the world are the symptoms of humanity's failure to understand and embrace our essential oneness. We also believe that the threats of climate change, gender discrimination, extreme wealth and poverty, unfair distribution of resources can never be resolved if we do not awaken to our dependence upon each other. Racism runs deep, and it infects the hearts of white and black Americans. Both these groups have to realize that this problem cannot be solved easily, and it will take work. And unfortunately, not everyone's going to be as willing as we are to put the work forward. The Baha'i Universal House of Justice, which is the governing body for the Baha'i world community, came out with a letter to all Baha'is around America. In the letter, it listed ways that we could overcome these hard times and what we could do in our communities to build strength between everyone. We are also told that it is one thing to protest against particular forms of injustice. It is a far more profound challenge to create a new framework for justice. To me, this means that although currently protesting, trying to change laws is what we are doing to have justice for the way Black Americans have been treated wrong, we are going to have to rewrite our whole system in order for things to be perfect. Racism is so deep and intertwined within America that that's the only sure way of getting it to reset. For years, the Baha'i community has been involved in children's classes, youth classes, and junior youth classes that center around the development of character. These are designed for everyone, no matter what religion, background, or education you have. We believe that everyone is born with gems of inestimable value. And unfortunately, although school is good at giving us academic education, they are not always all that great at coming up with character development or helping us with character development. So, much of the curriculum in these different youth, junior youth, and children classes center around virtues like justice, truthfulness, responsibility, respectfulness, and selflessness. After George Floyd was murdered, a Baha'i institution developed a college credit course about anti-racism that is free for people who want to try it for the first time and extremely inexpensive if you want to have it as a repetitive class. And those are just a couple of the ways that the Baha'i community is working towards racial justice. Thank you so much for letting me present.
Thank you so much, Nuri. Our next panelist is Dr. David Evans, and he will be speaking about a Christian perspective on racial justice. Dr. Evans is an associate professor of history and intercultural studies at Eastern Mennonite Seminary. His teaching and research focus on the braided identity categories of race, religion, and nation. He is the co-editor of the book, Between the World of Ta-Nehisi Coates and Christianity.
Thank you. I wish that I could, like our last presenter, say that Christianity has a uniform way of addressing racial justice, such that we heard from Martin Luther King Jr., where he spoke of a dream of Christian brotherhood and fellowship between people of all faiths and all races. Unfortunately, the perspectives of the Christian faith are many. And by many, I mean that at times Christianity has been involved in the creation of racial injustice from the very beginnings of the Christian church. What I mean here is that all the way back in the ancient period of Christianity, Christians were concerned with their identities, defining themselves over and against Jews, and introducing an anti-Semitism to the Mediterranean world that would be devastating for Jews across what would become Europe and years to follow. Christians were participants in Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, and can trace the beginnings of anti-Semitism all the way back to the foundations of Christianity. And then we see Christians from the medieval period and moving forward, expressing anti-Islamic views, right? And Christians during the Crusades, killing Muslims and other people who would not convert to Christianity. And so when we talk about racial justice, one of the things that Christians have begun to do is they've begun to confess and acknowledge their participation in racism against other people. It would be nice to say that Christians have learned a lot since that time, particularly because of the movement of Martin Luther King and others during the civil rights movement. But that is not exactly the case. Because the very things that folks in the civil rights movement were fighting against, people from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and others, were things that Christians themselves had created. That is to say that all the way back to the beginnings of enslavement here in the United States, we have Christians like Christopher Columbus who were willing to enslave indigenous people on the account that they were not white men. And we have Christians who thought it was their right, according to how they read the scriptures, to enslave Black people because they believed that they were cursed by God with dark skin. And so for many people, for many African descendants, Christianity itself was a kind of terror, was a kind of nightmare as opposed to a dream. But in one of the most amazing things that has ever happened in the history of the United States of America, those people, African Americans or who would become Americans, Black people, took on the faith of their oppressor and took Christianity that had oppressed them and turned it into a faith of liberation. And so we hear about people like James Cone or Ella Baker or Rosa Parks, who are part of the NAACP, W.E.B. Du Bois and others, who are willing to march against injustice and oppression. We hear about people like Richard Allen, who founded the African Methodist Episcopal Church, who saw America not as a great promised land, as white people did, where they could oppress other people, but they saw America as the land of Egypt from which they needed to be freed. And so as we think about a response from Christianity to racial injustice and the promotion of racial justice, we have to be careful, because not everyone sees it the same way. Martin Luther King's most staunch opponents were white Christians from places like Methodism, from the Episcopal Church, from the Southern Baptist Convention, right? Many of our Christian churches themselves were founded on segregation. And so now we have people like Leroy Barber and others who together are standing up against racial injustice because of the traditions of Black folks who have taken on Christianity and used it as a force for liberation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Evans. Next, we'll hear from Syed Omair, an imam and youth teacher at the Al Dulles Area Muslim Society Center in Sterling, Virginia.
Thank you very much, Nicole. I'd like to start in the name of God. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I'm going to start with a quote by Reverend King, which he said in his speech, "I've been to the mountaintop," which was delivered in 1968 in Memphis. In it, he quotes the parable of the Good Samaritan, and he says something really inspiring, which I think we need to discuss and will allow us to look at the Islamic viewpoint. So he says, they talked about a man who fell among thieves, and you remember that a Levite and a priest passed by on the other side. They didn't stop to help him. And finally, a man of another race came. He got down from his beast, decided not to be compassionate by proxy, but with him administering first aid, he helped the man in need. Jesus ended up saying, this was the good man, this was the great man, because he had the capacity to project the I into the thou and to be concerned about his brother. These words of Dr. King really encapsulate what the Islamic viewpoint is towards racial justice. If we look at the primary sources, the ideals of Islam are very clearly espoused by the Quran, which is the Muslim holy book, and by the Hadith literature, which are the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. The Quran tells us, and I'll just quote two brief verses from it. In chapter 49, verse 13, it says, "O mankind, we have created you male and female and made you into nations and tribes that you may know and recognize one another. Verily, the most noble of you to God is the most righteous of you. Verily, God is knowing and aware." And in another verse, chapter 16, verse 90, God says, "Indeed, God orders justice and good conduct and giving to those close to you, and forbids immorality and bad conduct and oppression. He admonishes you that perhaps you may be reminded." In the final sermon of the Prophet Muhammad, he said to his people, "O people, your Lord is one, and your Father is one. All of you are from Adam, and Adam came from earth. The noblest of you in the God's sight is the most God-fearing. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor does a light-skinned man have superiority over a dark-skinned man except by piety. So the ideals of Islam, as I said, are clearly stated in these sources, but to echo what Dr. Evans said, the reality doesn't always live up to the ideals. In our community here in Sterling, we have a largely immigrant community. Many of the people in our congregation are not aware of the struggles that happened by African Americans and African American Muslims within the civil rights movement and recently as well. So our job lately has been a lot on educating our congregation on what African American people went through and what other people are going through now in the fight for equality. We had an event, for example, on Juneteenth, which many people don't know about, that historic day, June 19th, and the significance that has towards African American people and African American Muslims. Recently, we also done protests, joined the protests for racial equality, as well as for the Rohingya population and the Uyghur Muslims. We do things like bus people to DC for protests and marches, and we try to encourage our congregation to be involved through education and these sorts of things. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Syed. Finally, to speak about a Jewish perspective on racial justice, we have Sarah Aber and Haley Berman. Haley is the president of GMU Hillel, and Sarah is the social action chair.
Thank you, Nicole. Hello, everyone. My name is Haley Berman, and I'm the student president of George Mason Hillel.
And my name's Sarah Aber, and I'm the social action chair of George Mason Hillel.
Rabbi Hillel once stated, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when?" In Judaism, there is a strong belief in what many call tikkun olam, or healing the world. There are many interpretations to tikkun olam, but the majority of American Jews would describe this phrase as a social action movement to repair the world, which has ultimately morphed into Jewish social justice. Basically, Jewish people bear responsibility to the world, not only for our own spiritual, moral, or material welfare, but also for the welfare of the whole society. Some rabbis have even drawn upon the concept of tikkun olam in religious texts, such as the Mishnah and Talmud, believing these readings point to the importance of creating this Jewish social action through systemic changes, and not only in our society, but in our laws as well.
While there are varying opinions on what tikkun olam is or how Jews should react to social justice, personally, we believe the concept of tikkun olam directly relates to racial justice. It's believed that an important process to practicing social action in Judaism includes completing ethical and ritual mitzvot, or mitzvahs, which can be described as good deeds, commandments, or religious obligations. And as a people in religion, Jews have historically been discriminated against and exiled worldwide. So it's important to realize that we share the same goal as many other minority groups of equality and acceptance. And as such, we believe that the overall movement of tikkun olam applies to everyone, not just individual groups. Throughout our religious text, we're reminded of this through passages and holidays that implore us to remember our roots, like in the Haggadah, when it's stated, "Remember, we were once slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt." Or additionally, in the Torah, it is also stated, "Justice, justice shall you pursue, and love your fellow as yourself."
There is a strong importance to standing up for those who are facing injustice, and to be compassionate and righteous for everyone and not just ourselves. Rabbi Hillel even stated, "What is hateful to you, do not unto others." That is the entirety of the Torah. Everything else is commentary. The core principles of our religion are based around helping those that face injustice or strife, to treat others the way that we want to be treated. While Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. brought great strides for racial and social justice, there is still so much to amend. If we do not stand up for other minorities that face the same discriminations that we want eradicated from our own communities, then we will have done a disservice to ourselves and to our core beliefs.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah and Haley. And it was so good to hear both of you together. Now I'd like to introduce Neve Leibowitz and Liana Tedessa. who are with us to share their experience with Operation Understanding DC. And Operation Understanding DC is a year-long cross-cultural education program whose mission is to build a generation of Black and Jewish community leaders who promote respect, understanding, and cooperation while working together to eradicate racism, anti-Semitism, and all forms of discrimination.
Hello, everyone. My name is Liana Taddasa, and I'm currently a senior at Washington Liberty High School in Arlington, Virginia. On January 13th, 2020, my whole life changed. I was walking home from school when I got a call. As I checked my phone to see who was calling me, I saw that it was a 202 number, and my face changed immediately. At that point, I realized exactly who it was. I had found out that I had been chosen to be a member of Class 26 of Operation Understanding DC's Social Justice Fellowship. Prior to this year, Operation Understanding DC, or OUDC, only offered its Social Justice Fellowship to students who identified as Black and/or Jewish. Since the fight against racism, anti-Semitism, and all forms of oppression should involve people from all walks of life, OUDC made a historic change to offer its one-year program to students of all racial or religious backgrounds. This is to everyone's advantage because now the conversation surrounding social equity can involve even more perspectives. As an Ethiopian American woman growing up in the US, I struggled to know where I fit in. My name was different, my hair was different, my religion was different, my skin was different, and my language was different. I was too Black for the white kids, yet also too white for the Black kids. I had to get comfortable with being uncomfortable at such a young age, and as a result, struggled with finding my identity a great deal. When I got to high school, things started to become a lot clearer for me. I knew I wanted to have an impact on my community, as well as be an inspiration and a mentor for others, but I just didn't know how or where to start. I started asking myself the question of, how am I going to encourage others to explore their identity if I don't even know my own? At that point, I realized I had to go on a journey of my own in order to discover who I really was, so that I would be able to help other Black or brown children who were going through the same identity crisis as I. The deeper the roots, the stronger the tree. This is a theme that stuck with me during my journey at OUDC. The more in touch I am with my roots, the stronger I become. I had such a hard time connecting with my roots because our schools had never taught anything beyond the textbook Black history. 9 months ago, I wouldn't have been able to tell you that the origins of the police came from them being slave patrols, or that Anacostia was originally a working-class residential area exclusive to whites, or even that Black mothers are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy. While these facts are disheartening to hear, it's a truth that we have to face one day or another. Not only was I able to learn about inequality and how to combat oppressive systems that still affect people today, but I was also able to surround myself with like-minded individuals, which made my journey with OUDC even more pleasurable. Every summer for the past 25 years, every OUDC class has gone on a summer journey through the Deep South, where they explore Black and Jewish history in an experience that no classroom setting would ever be able to provide. Do the most that you can, with the time that you have, in the place that you can. This is a quote spoken by Rabbi Micah Greenstein to us over the summer, and this quote is exactly what OUDC embodied.
Thank you, Liana. I'd like to start with a question. Have you ever prayed with your feet? This seems absurd, but I'd like to provide an anecdote that illuminates this idea. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, a Jewish immigrant who fled Nazi Germany in the 30s, had a close relationship with Reverend Martin Luther King and was active in the civil rights movement. Upon returning from the 1965 Selma to Montgomery Voting Rights March, Rabbi Heschel was asked about his experience at the march. He responded, "I felt my legs were praying." This story represents what OUDC is all about. For people from different faiths, religions, and ethnicities to find common ground and to come together to fight for justice and equity. Just like Rabbi Heschel and Reverend Martin Luther King were able to find common ground together and fight for a common goal, this was one of my favorite parts of the OUDC program. comparing my own Jewish traditions with the cultural traditions of my Black peers. Last spring, all of us celebrated Passover, a Jewish holiday commemorating the Exodus and freedom from slavery that the Israelites experienced. We also celebrated Juneteenth, which commemorates, as Imam Syed mentioned, the freedom of Black slaves. We discussed how both of these holidays relay the idea that freedom and equality are unfinished work, and there's still so much more to fight for. There's a special word in Hebrew that conveys an idea of mutual responsibility, but it is more than that. This word indicates that as a part of a community, our own personal well-being depends on the well-being of all members of the community. And I want to teach you this word. It's alvut hadadit. I want everyone in the audience to say it. Alvut hadadit, which translates to mutual guarantee, but literally means solidarity. Being part of the OUDC class of 26 feels like being part of a family, but not just a regular family, a family with a mission. Let's continue on this mission of fighting against injustice, taking care of each other, and participating in Alvut Hadadit.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Neve and Liana. And it was so good to hear your own personal stories too. So thank you for sharing that with us. So now it's time to hear from you, our viewers and our listeners. And our panelists are here and ready to answer your questions. So if you'd like to hear more from them and about their experience or their perspective on racial justice, please send us your questions through Facebook or YouTube comments. Alrighty, and our first question is, what are your thoughts on how conversations and efforts centered on anti-racism can become a continued part of what our faiths do, and not just a one-time action when it is prompted by tragedy? Great question.
I think having these types of discussions constantly are very important, and especially when nothing's going on, because when nothing's going on, that's when people should be talking about it the most, to make sure that nothing ever happens. We should never get to the point where something does happen and our country doesn't respond to it. And so that's what I think these conversations help with, is preventing it from happening in the first place. It's almost like you wear a helmet to not hurt your head when you're biking. You don't wear a helmet after you hit your head while you're biking. So I think it helps with that.
I would just say, because of some of the things that my faith, Christianity, has been a part of, I think it begins with a confession and then a deep look at our theology, our practices, and the foundations upon which our institutions were built. And then we have to do some serious dismantling and reforming of those institutions and those practices so that we can become fully anti-racist institutions and members of our faith tradition.
As for the Muslim faith at Adams, what we've noticed is this, very similar to what this question is saying, that there's a lot of responses when things go wrong. But rather than responding all the time, I think being proactive, and especially, as Dr. Evans pointed out, taking a good look at yourself and dismantling a lot of the prejudices that we have inside us, opening ourselves up to education and creating really educational programs or courses is the solution, rather than just having, one-off talks or events when something goes wrong.
I absolutely agree. And I think that a lot that we can do to be proactive is just opening up conversations like these. Keeping an open communication will help unite minorities nonetheless. And I think that's a great first step.
Awesome. So we'll go ahead and move along to the next question. But I think it's great just the emphasis on consistency and openness in dialogue, and having conversations like this. I mean, this should happen more often. So, alrighty, next question. Are there practical and direct measures faith communities should take on the path towards racial justice? If so, can you share examples?
One of my favorite things that I see a lot of popes do is, I don't know if you guys have all seen this or not, but when people come into the Vatican and they wash their feet, and it's always very touching for me to show that regardless of who you are, your status, as a person or in an organization, to have that kind of humility to do something like that. I think a lot of faiths need to organize really simple things, feeding people that are hungry, visiting the sick, doing things that are practical, that are easy to do, and yet have a deep impact on people. I remember, as Adams, as our community does, we often distribute food, distribute lunches and stuff to people who are needy. And when you put yourself in that position to really, have some empathy with another person, I think a lot of breakthroughs happen from that. So practical, small actions rather than, as we were saying, just talks and talks all the time. Although the conversations are obviously important too.
There's a song in my tradition that begins, "Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me." And there's a tradition in our communities of not beginning with ourselves, but casting blame on others. I think one of the most important things we can do is take a serious look at ourselves. Racism, racial injustice is not somewhere out there. It's a part of our church communities. It's a part of our Bible studies. It's a part of our seminaries. And until we can face those challenges that are a part of our own communities, we can't begin to take steps towards other aspects of racial justice. And so I would say that we begin by looking at ourselves, being honest with ourselves, and recognizing that oftentimes we are part of the problem.
I think another measure we can take is education. And they already listed most of the ones that I was thinking of, so. But I think education really helps, because if people are more educated and not as ignorant, they won't act in the way, or act immature. As I said in my presentation, we have like youth groups and junior youth groups and children's classes to try to educate our community, and just everyone's community in general, about just basic virtues. And I feel like that is one thing that's always skipped out of, especially in school, is learning these basic virtues. Yeah, you get in trouble if you don't follow them, but we don't actually learn them. And so I think that's very important. Like, for instance, respect. I could dislike someone, but as long as I still have respect for them, I think that's a very key point.
Yeah, I completely agree with what everybody else has said so far. I think specifically in the Jewish community, like what Dr. Evans said, unfortunately, there is a bit of stereotyping with other religions and other ethnic groups, just because I think so many Jews have had such a hard time fitting in that they kind of go on the defense instead of offense. And that's something that I think a large part of our community needs to look at first. But in addition to that, we're talking about small steps and doing small things. Like, in addition to these conversations, actually going out there and helping people. And I would hope that in time, the goal would be, instead of just calling it small steps and acting as if we're doing extra to go about it, it becomes common practice in our communities, where it's not something that we have to think about doing. It's just something that we do because it's the right thing to do.
Awesome. And to kind of draw from all of that, I have a question, and I don't know, you could take this whatever way you want, but where do we find the balance between there's a lot of difficult things going on in the world, a lot of battles we could engage in, but we can't pick every battle. So where is the balance between calling things out and maybe engaging in dialogue or maybe instructing people that are ignorant in certain areas, and then just living your life in a way that treats everyone with the same dignity and just in doing kind of the individual work that way and looking at yourself. Where is that balance and kind of like picking our battles and how much we can do there?
I think that's a great question. In some ways, I think that balance is important in the way that we live our lives. And I also think that we have to pay attention to our passions and what we're called to. You're right, we can't all do everything. Racism and fighting racism is not solely an individual thing, but we can live our lives in such a way that we take a holistic approach. I think one of our co-panelists, Neve, I think said something about solidarity. If we decide or to live our lives in such a way that we're in solidarity with those who are most vulnerable and most oppressed, then in our individual lives and our relationships, we will have good relationships with those people. We will feel like the things that are happening to them are happening to us as well. And so in living our life and trying to make our own lives better, we'll be better than the lives of other people. We'll be a part of their communities will be our communities. And so in terms of talking about balance, living our own life will be a way of engaging injustice because we are in solidarity with those who experience injustice.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I love that you emphasized the ripple effect of our own lives, because I think it can be easy to think that, oh, well, I'm just one person and what I do is insignificant, but you really just emphasize it's not. And it has a great effect on the broader society. So we'll go ahead and move on to our next question. And it is, do you feel there is an internal racism in your faith towards people of color? And if so, which steps are being done to combat it?
So,
go ahead.
Sorry. No, please, Dr. Evans.
I don't want to dominate, so I'll just say a little bit. Yes, pictures of white Jesus, a white God, white angels, so much of what happens in the United States in particular centers around whiteness. And I can go into Black churches and see the same kinds of images. And I just read a study from UCLA that said that those people who are part of faith traditions where they picture their God as white are more likely to want white people to be in leadership or to value white people in leadership more than people of other races. And so there's a direct impact upon the way that we think the world ought to be when we envision God or our deities as white. And that is something that we see in Christianity quite a bit.
I just was going to say among the Muslim populations in America, so the question says about faith, but really I think the problem is with the faithful. There's definitely a lot of stereotyping. There's a lot of bigotry. Many Muslims in this country are first-generation immigrants or second-generation sometimes, but majority are first-generation. And they bring with them a lot of baggage from overseas, from ethnic problems that they've had, for generations. And, you put all these people in a room together and there's going to be some tension. And so there definitely is a lot of bigotry that we are trying to address, as a generational thing. I don't think that it's not going to be solved, in the short run, but it's a long-term project. And within our youth, we're seeing a lot of that erased and washed away, which is really great. But definitely, there's these things come up, and we have to deal with them in a very sensitive way. And first and foremost, like Dr. Evans was saying, we have to, look at ourselves, really have a deep, introspection as to who we are, what we're bringing to the table, what baggage we're bringing to the table, what prejudices we're bringing. and try to elevate ourselves. As I said in my talk, there are ideals and then there's reality. The ideals for a lot of our religions say one thing, but they're not always followed. So trying to match the reality to the ideals is really what our goal should be.
Great, thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and move along to our last question for tonight. And it is, what is the religious text that most inspires you in how you interact with others, especially people who are different from you or difficult for you to encounter? With others, especially people who are different from you or difficult for you to encounter.
I could take a stab at that one.
Especially people who are different from you or difficult for you to encounter.
So, in the Genesis, when it describes when God created man, it says B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, and that really inspires me. That we're all created in the image of God. If you're Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Sikh, if you're a different race, we're all created in the image of God, and I think that inspires me to, even if someone is a different religion than me, to still treat them with respect and of course stand with them in solidarity when they're going through struggles. And I think it conveys the idea we're all in the image of God.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for sending in your questions. And we encourage you to continue this conversation about racial justice from faith perspectives with your friends, your family members, in your faith communities, and especially with your fellow Mason students and faculty. And in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his legacy of working for racial justice, we'll conclude with a performance of Dr. King's favorite hymn, performed by Tilly Blanding, who marched with Dr. King. And before that, I want to thank Reverend Johnson and our panelists, Nuri Songer-Johnson, Dr. David Evans, Syed Omair, Sarah Aber, Haley Berman, Neve Leibowitz, and Liana Tadessa. And thank you all so much for speaking with us tonight. Now, performing There is a Balm in Gilead. Here's Tilly Blanding.
There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. I said, if you can pray like Peter, I said, if you can preach like Paul, well, I want you to go on and tell all of your loved ones that Jesus died to save us all. There is a balm, oh, in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sick